This is the Jeffersonians and the Federalists, Objective 1, about how the Federalists and Anti-Federalists started the tradition of political parties in the United States. And the place we want to start, of course, is with the outgoing president, George Washington, and the legacy that he leaves behind. But what is that legacy? Well, we know that George Washington is on the dollar bill and the quarter, and that he's on Mount Rushmore. If you take a close look, you can see old George here on the left, taking his rightful place among Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. We know that he has an entire state named after him, that of course being the state of Washington, established in 1889. And we know that there is a Washington monument to him located in Washington, D.C., a town named after him. For the record, this would have been the exact view that Martin Luther King would have had right in front of the Lincoln Memorial, looking out at the Washington Monument as he gave his I Have a Dream speech in 1963. And it's also the view that Forrest had in the movie Forrest Gump when he was addressing the crowd about what it was like to be in Vietnam. If you look over here to the left, you can almost picture Jenny running out into the water to meet Forrest in that heartwarming embrace that brought them back together. We also know that one of his legacies is Washington, D.C. itself, not just for the fact that the town is named after him, but also that he did the original surveying of the boggy marsh in Maryland known as Foggy Bottom that would eventually become Washington, D.C. That's, of course, respected and recognized with the Washington Monument right in the middle here, surrounded by the Lincoln Memorial, where Martin Luther King again gave his I Have a Dream speech, the U.S. Capitol, and then way off in the distance over here somewhere, the White House. But to me, the Washington legacy is not about being on some money or being on a mountainside or having a state named after you or even having a cool monument in a cool city named for you. The Washington legacy is about respect. The respect that the person in this house right here, a house that George Washington himself never got to live in, has for what George Washington did. And the respect we all have for what George Washington did. You know, the idea that he would choose to retire in 1797 after 2 terms, he could have stayed there a lot longer. But he set a tradition that would continue until the 22nd Amendment of 1951 made term limits, 2 terms as president, a mandatory thing. George Washington impacted not just the American presidency, but lots of things in our foreign policy and domestic policy that we still respect today. It was George Washington who came up with the concept of isolationism in foreign affairs, the idea of staying out of world affairs except for extraordinary emergencies. He said that in his farewell address, and that's a policy that we continued until 1945, the end of World War II. Isolationism would drive American foreign policy for close to 200 years after George Washington was gone. George Washington also established a strong federal government, although Hamilton is mostly given the credit for that. And George Washington would create the cabinet and other presidential traditions that our current presidents still follow in the modern day. Washington essentially created what and how the American president was supposed to be. And he disliked political parties that were emerging. He said they would ruin the United States, and frankly, not too many people today would argue with him. George Washington, when you look at the full body of work, has got to be regarded one of the most respected presidents, if not the most respected president we've ever had in American history. Not just for all the legacies of the dollar bill and the mountainside and everything else, and the cool city and the cool monument and that type of thing, but the actual impact he had on foreign policy, domestic policy, and the American presidency that would continue for generations to come. But there would come a time, of course, when the experimental stage was over, and that was with the death of George Washington in 1797. He was gone and not able to advise anybody else that was following in his footsteps, and it was time for someone else to step in. Alexander Hamilton, of course, would have been the most likely successor, as he was Washington's personal assistant in the American Revolution, and one of his most important one of his most important secretaries, the Secretary of the Treasury, in the initial cabinet that he came up with. Remember that it was Hamilton who basically is considered the father of the American economy and helped Washington greatly. But his policies, which helped the wealthy, made him very unpopular with the masses and likely would have eliminated any shot of him being elected President of the United States, so he didn't have any chance to win the election. Therefore, after Washington is gone, the mantle falls to this guy, Washington's Vice President, John Adams. Now, he was the logical choice. He was a Federalist who didn't initially go to the Constitutional Convention, but eventually became a Federalist, and as Washington's Vice President, probably had a better chance to win than the greatly unpopular Alexander Hamilton would have a chance to win. But while Washington had been elected unanimously to his first term, by the time he was gone, Vice President John Adams would have no real shot at getting a unanimous election. During the time of Washington's presidency, with Hamilton's policies, the rift between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists was getting worse, and quite by accident, they would become the first political parties in America. Even after the Constitution was ratified, while both sides continued to fight each other. I mean, we know that they disagreed on the Constitution itself, the Federalists wanting it and the Anti-Federalists not wanting it. But again, even after that Constitution was settled and the country agreed to follow it, both sides continued after each other all the way through the Washington presidency. The Federalists, led by Washington and Hamilton, had created a strong central government that protected the wealthy. The common phrase among Hamilton's people was, "Those who own the country ought to govern it." He was speaking, of course, of the wealthy upper class. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, led by Thomas Jefferson, felt like the arrogant Federalist policies hurt states' rights. They demanded more rule by the people and less rule by the central government. It was essentially the wealthy northern urban merchants versus poor rural southern agriculturalists. And by 1793, the constant warring between the two had morphed into, really, the country's first political parties. Washington, of course, did not like this development as he left office, but he was leaving and didn't really have a whole lot of say in the matter. So the election of 1796 became the first election between two distinct political parties. John Adams, Washington's vice president, was running as a Federalist versus Thomas Jefferson running as the quintessential Anti-Federalist. It was a pretty nasty campaign. It was the snobbish intellectuals of the Federalist Party versus the common man of the Anti-Federalist Party. Eventually, Adams would win the presidency in a very close election, 71 to 68 in the Electoral College. And if you take a look at the map here, you'll see that that's primarily due to the New England states. New England carried John Adams to victory. The Midwestern or the Middle Atlantic and Southern states were really split between Adams and Thomas Jefferson, although Jefferson got quite a few Electoral College votes in the South. But what was interesting about that time is that presidential candidates didn't pick vice presidents to run with them. The guy who got the second highest number of votes became vice president. So Thomas Jefferson became John Adams' vice president. This was an old tradition that was eventually changed by the 12th Amendment of 1804, but after the 1796 and 1800 elections, it was the guy who got the second most votes that became the vice president of the United States. This would set Thomas Jefferson up well, and he'd eventually become the third president of the United States after the 1800 election. As for John Adams, well, he was no George Washington. He was to be respected, without a doubt. His personality was pretty simple. He was a great statesman and very important in the formation of the federal government. He was short, he was bald, rotund, but his biggest problem was that he was very insecure. He was greatly aristocratic and a stuffy individual who was a bit of an intellectual and not well liked by the common man or the masses. He had very big shoes to fill, and also it didn't help that Alexander Hamilton absolutely hated him. Now, Adams serves only one term as U.S. President from 1797 to 1801, and he's the first president to serve in Washington, D.C., but that would really be the highlight of his presidency. His domestic policies were really centered around two things: the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts were against poor immigrants who had supported Anti-Federalists in the 1796 election and were still supporting Anti-Federalists during Adams' presidency. His insecurities got the best of him, and he decided he was going to take it out on the supporters of his opponents. Therefore, with the Alien Acts, he pushed through an increased residency requirement for citizenship. It bumped it up to 14 years. You had to live in the U.S. for 14 years in order to be a resident at that time. Prior to that, it had been 5 years. So this was a direct shot at immigrants who were going to support the Anti-Federalist Party. He also gave the president the power to deport foreigners during peacetime and either deport or imprison foreigners during a war. This was also a big change in recent U.S. policy and didn't really endear John Adams to anyone. Now, the second part of this, the Sedition Act, was a complete violation of First Amendment rights. It basically said that obstructing government policy or speaking out against the government in any way was punishable by fines and imprisonment. The First Amendment said you could exactly do that. You could exactly petition your government and speak out against it. So it's a complete violation of First Amendment rights. Many Anti-Federalists were jailed after trials with Federalist judges because they were found guilty of the Sedition Act. So John Adams had a very nondescript set of domestic policies during his presidency, and it did not make him very popular with the people, and therefore not very popular for re-election. Okay, that's it for Objective 1. Thanks for listening.